So President Obama was giving a speech to all of the graduating cadets at the West Point Academy. Of course, the highlight of those graduation ceremonies for me is always when they throw their hats up in the air. But the low light is the president giving his address. And I got a little sound from it. I'm going to play first one clip where he talks about American exceptionalism. Here, cut number one.
Even American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being. But what makes us exceptional is not our ability to flout international norms and the rule of law. It is our willingness to affirm them through our actions.
So that's what American exceptionalism means to the president? Our willingness to meddle in the affairs of other nations? That's it? I mean, the whole idea about American exceptionalism had to do with our freedom, our liberty, our constraint of government. What made America exceptional was the exceptional amount of freedom from government that we once had. That was the whole very concept. It had nothing to do with our willingness to intervene in the affairs of other nations. In fact, maybe part of what made us exceptional is that we weren't going to do that we were going to be more concerned about what's happening in our own country and try to stay out of these foreign entanglements. But here is the worst part of the speech. When the president starts talking about how strong America is relative to the rest of the world. Here, you won't believe some of this sound, so let's play it so you know I'm not making it up. Here, cut number 2.
And through it all, we've refocused our investments in what has always been a key source of American strength, a growing economy that can provide opportunity for everybody who's willing to work hard and take responsibility here at home. In fact, by most measures, America has rarely been stronger relative to the rest of the world. Those who argue otherwise, who suggest that America is in decline or has seen its global leadership slip away, are either misreading history or engaged in partisan politics.
Well, not exactly. I think it's the president who is not simply misreading history, but who hasn't even read history. So there's nothing to misread. He says that by most measures, we've never been stronger relative to the rest of the world. By what measures? I can't think of a single measure where that would be the case. In fact, by almost every measure, America has never been in worse shape relative to the rest of the world. Does the president not even understand what America used to be like? Does he not understand what America was like, let's say, in the 1950s? Does he not know? Well, I'll talk about it. America was the richest, most powerful nation in the world, and our leadership was unquestioned. We were the world's wealthiest creditor nation. And what does that mean? That means that the world owed us a lot of money. Americans were so rich relative to other people that we made investments all over Asia, all over Europe, and we got income on those investments. And we had much more income from our foreign investments than foreigners had in investments in America. Creditor nation. That is a good thing. Today, not only is America not a creditor nation, we're the world's biggest debtor nation. In fact, not only are we the world's biggest debtor nation, we owe more money than all of the other debtor nations on the planet combined. So how is that a position of strength? We went from being the world's richest creditor to being its biggest debtor. We had all these assets, and now we have all these liabilities. How is that a positive relationship with the rest of the world? Back in the 1950s, we had a trade surplus. That meant American businesses were so productive that we had all this excess production that we sold around the world. Today, we have a huge trade deficit of $500 billion a year. That's like, if you want to think about it in terms of a corporation, we were operating at a huge profit back then, and now we're running at a huge loss. So how is that a better position? How are we stronger relative to the world when we have a huge loss than when we had a big profit? Think about it from a per capita GDP or per capita income. Americans were the highest earning people in the world. Nobody earned as much as Americans. I mean, we were the envy of the world. Where did the expression "the ugly American" come from? Right? It came from average Americans going to Europe and being a snob because they were so rich compared to the Europeans. We had so much money to spend, we didn't know what to do with it. You know, the Americans were all over the world traveling. We were the Japanese tourists in the 1950s. Our kids were going to Europe on $1 a day and living it up. You know, my dad tells me that when he used to go skiing in Switzerland, you know, Austria, France, when he was young, because it was cheaper than going Switzerland skiing here in Vermont. So he would fly to Europe. And he said when he got there, you know, he had fiberglass skis, and all the Europeans were still skiing on wood. That's how more advanced we were. They were still on wooden skis. And the lift tickets were a joke because we were so much richer. I mean, my father tells me when he was in Europe, he was a private in the army. A private in Europe, and he said he lived like a king. He couldn't believe the amount of food he could buy in a restaurant for like $1. You know, how wealthy he felt on a private salary in Europe. So, you know, to say this, I mean, remember the articles about the minimum wage in Switzerland? They were thinking about imposing a minimum wage of about $50,000 a year. And they said, well, you know, 90% of the people in Switzerland already make more than $50,000 a year. I mean, what percentage of Americans make more than $50,000 a year? 20%? You got 90% of the Swiss. Back in 1950, the average American made more than the average Swiss. Now it's, you know, the complete opposite. In fact, the Swiss are way ahead of us. In fact, there are a lot of countries today where the median income, high average income, is higher than in the United States. In 1950, there wasn't a single country where that was true. In fact, the gap between America and number 2 was enormous. Nobody could even come close. Yet for the president to say that there's never been a time in history where America has been stronger. I mean, just look at our GDP. I mean, we used to be 50% of world GDP. I don't even think we're 20% now. I mean, back in the 1950s, we consumed 90% of everything. 90% of the cars, 90% of the televisions, 90% of the phones. I mean, everything was in America. We were so rich, the rest of the world was like living on another planet. Now they've caught up and many have passed us because of all the government we have now. Now, I wonder if history is a required course over there at West Point. I wonder if the people sitting in the grandstands there knew how much the president was either lying or how ignorant the president was about American history, about understanding what America's place in the world was and how dramatically our stature has been diminished over the decades. I mean, does he not know that? Does he not appreciate that? I mean, America of the 1950s, I mean, or late 90s, that was the America that had the money to do the Marshall Plan. I mean, which, of course, I was not in favor of the Marshall Plan, but the fact that we could afford it, the fact that we had all this money to spend, bailing out, helping out Europe and Japan, that's how rich America was. And we didn't have to borrow the money to do it. So anyone that alleges that America's lead over the world has never been greater, that we've never been richer in comparison to the rest of the world, has absolutely no understanding of American history, of what this country used to be. Either that or they're just an outright liar. So you take your pick as to which one the president is. But now let us turn our attention to Joe Biden speaking to our Air Force Academy grads about, again, how great America is and how we don't have to worry about countries like China or Japan because they're nothing compared to us. All right? Here, cut number 4.
I used to give commencement speeches in the 90s, Superintendent. And the line, some of you will remember, some of you who are older, remember was that Japan was going to eat our lunch, that Japan was the future. We also used to be told that China, and it's true, is graduating 6 to 8 times as many scientists and engineers as we have.
So he said, oh, don't worry. Everything is great. We used to be told that Japan was going to eat our lunch. And oh, look, oh, what a disaster Japan is. And, now we're being told that we got to worry about China. And, of course, we didn't have to worry about Japan. We didn't have to worry about China. Yeah, but, what about all the rest of the world? Because way back in the 1990s, right, America was a much larger percentage of the global economy. Our stock market was a much larger percentage of global stock market capitalization. We have had a significant decline in our position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. The U.S. dollar was a much larger percentage of global reserves back then than it is today. So by all objective measures, the people who were warning about the risks of an American decline in the 1990s were right. They were right. How many more of our factories have shut down? You know how much larger our trade deficits are now than they were in the 1990s? They're off the charts compared to where they were, certainly in the early 1990s. By the very end of the 1990s, those deficits started getting bigger. And, of course, they went off the charts in the next decade. But in the early 1990s, our trade deficits were, 15 billion a month, 10, 15 billion. They weren't 40 billion, 50 billion, the way they are now. Sometimes we get lucky and they dip into the 30s. But they were right. The people who were warning about America being in decline, they were correct. Here's a little bit more of Joe Biden at cut number 5.
But I challenge you, name me one innovative project, one innovative change, one innovative product that has come out of China. And I want Japan to succeed as I do China. But give me a break.
Give him a break. Yes, because these people are too dumb to innovate. Name me one innovative product that's come out of China. I'm sure there's been many. I mean, I don't know, off the top of my head. Maybe we can research it. But one of the innovations out of China is to reduce the costs, to produce things less expensively. Innovation in the production of goods. I know that. I mean, why doesn't he ask the cadets, name me one thing that you own that was made in America? That's a difficult thing to do. They throw all those hats up in the air. Where do you think those hats are made? I mean, maybe they're probably made in China. They're not made in America. Neither are their shoes. Neither are their uniforms. Something like 97% of the clothing in America is imported. Imported. What about all the cameras that were filming this? Where were those cameras made? Japan, probably. Maybe Germany. None of them were made in America. There's not a single one of those cameras that was made in America. In the 1950s, all the cameras were made in America. All of them. We had lots of camera companies. All the consumer electronics. We started consumer electronics. All the television sets were made in America. All the radios were made in America. Now none of them are. Right? We owned those industries. The clothing was made in America too. The furniture. Furniture's not made here. All these things are made. So where China's nothing, they're making everything. How much money do we owe China? Trillions. We have a huge trade deficit with China. Give me a break. That is the problem. You're gonna talk about how great America is, and you're gonna be oblivious to the rest of the world. America was great, and America can be great again, but it ain't great now. We have serious, serious problems that these guys want to overlook, and they say that's patriotism. Oh, I don't want to talk down America. You know what? If America is having a problem, you got to address it. It's not patriotic to ignore the problem and just pretend that we're still as great as we used to be, or, in the words of Obama, greater than we ever were. That's not patriotic. That's more like treasonous, because you're allowing the decline to continue, to perpetuate, instead of saying, wait a minute, look at where we were and look at how far we've fallen. How do we stop this trend? How do we reverse this trend? How do we get back to where we were? That's what a patriot would do. Would talk about how much America has lost and wanting to get it back, not ignoring the massive decline in our economy, in our freedoms, in our standard of living, in our position relative to the rest of the world, and just pretending that everything is great. So you can talk up America, sound great, get applause from our graduating cadets. What kind of country are they graduating into, Mr. President? What kind of life can they look forward to? What kind of job prospects do they have outside of the U.S. military? Not all the people graduating from these academies want to work in the military for their entire lives. A lot of them are going to have children. What kind of country are their children going to live in? Are they going to grow up in? What kind of taxes are we going to face? What kind of employment prospects are we going to have? See, all these answers are pretty bleak if we stay on our current trajectory, instead of just pretending that everything is so great and trying to diminish the accomplishments of countries like China or the rest of the world that are succeeding in many of the areas that we are failing. China is succeeding because they emulated a lot of what America used to be. We need to learn that lesson. We need to emulate what America used to be. That was the great country. That was the exceptional country. Not what we've got now. Not this welfare state, command economy, bubble economy, borrow and spend, speculate, financial leverage and asset bubbles and debt and more debt. That's what we've got now. That's not exceptional, and that's not going to lead to higher standards of living. In fact, look again at the GDP numbers that came out. As bad as they were actually worse when you just look beyond consumer spending. The most important part of the GDP, as far as future economic growth, is investment spending. It's capital spending. Spending on capital equipment. That collapsed in the first quarter. And you're telling me that's because of the snow? That was because of the cold? I don't think so. And I don't think it's going to have a huge rebound in the spring. So this idea that America has never been stronger, that we have nothing to fear, that the people who were warning us about the threats of China, the threats of Japan, were wrong. No, it was the people who were ignoring those threats. Look at the automobile industry. Talking about, American automobile industry in the 1950s, almost all the cars on the roads in the 1950s were American made. How many different automobile companies did we have back then? Dozens. It wasn't just the big three. We had lots of automobile companies. The only people who owned imported cars in the 1950s were rich people. Really rich people had, an Italian sports car, maybe a German car. But it was rare. All the economy cars, they weren't made in Japan. They weren't made in Korea. They were made in America. And a lot of luxury cars. A Cadillac was considered, hey, if you had a Cadillac, that was about as good as it got, right? Who drives Cadillacs now? Pimps? But we owned that industry too in the 1950s. Now, most cars are foreign. In fact, look at GM. GM is just this year, GM has recalled more cars than they sold. How about that? And America has never been stronger? What are these guys kidding me?